the word resilience basically means that a system or an organism or any kind of uh, institution can bounce back after a stress occurs. And it's that idea of being more supple rather than brittle. And I think, with that in mind, looking at a lot of the systems that humans create are what we call brittle. You put a little bit of force on it and it breaks. It's like the difference between a dry leaf and a living leaf. Whereas in nature, natural systems are supple. You push on them and they can absorb a stress. An example of that would be like mangrove swamps. They buffer uh, tropical coastal areas from hurricanes and windstorms and big waves. And they diminish the force of that going in. Whereas you look at what humans do, we want to build homes and hotels and resorts right on the ocean. And then when a hurricane comes or something, and we also make the ocean facing side glass, which is very, that's the pretty much the definition of brittle. So, within that idea, expanding on it further, natural systems are complex. They have many interlocking features, whereas human systems are complicated. We take simple things and we make them complicated, where nature takes simple elements and weaves them together to create complex systems. So that leads us into the word regenerative. And natural systems have the ability to reproduce themselves, to regenerate themselves. You can think of one of those lizards that their tail falls off as a defensive mechanism and they can grow a new one. Salamanders can actually regrow new arms and legs. So that idea of regenerative is very much a buzzword right now out there. And in previous episodes, we explored how that term is used and how it's really become just a catchy buzzword, and it's not necessarily always used to describe what the word actually means, which is the ability to regenerate. So to revisit how I like to view the term regenerative is that if you have a continuum, that sustainability, which is the term we used to use, is the midpoint between destruction and regeneration. So just aiming for sustainability is a good goal, but it's not all the way there. Really, what we want to do is emulate natural systems in their suppleness, in their complexity, and in their ability to be resilient, to bounce back from a stress, or maybe even strengthen it. Another way to think of that is a tree. So, a tree, the more wind gets pushed on a tree, its tissues grow stronger and it adapts to the environment over time, not just in one lifetime, but over succeeding generations. So, in the notion of being complex, part of that complexity is the ability to respond to feedback loops. So, the wind is a feedback loop. So, trees over the generations, the one that's break, they die. Let's say the top of a tall tree breaks in a windstorm, then it's not going to be reproducing it after that point. Some of them will actually regrow, like hardwoods will regrow, but if a conifer blows over in a windstorm, it's not going to regrow. So its offspring will not be represented in the future iterations of that species. So going to that, I believe it was Einstein said the definition of stupidity is repeating the same thing and expecting different results. And human civilizations seem to do this. So let's say we have a hurricane in coastal Florida that destroys a whole swath of buildings. Or right now, tornadoes are ravaging the upper Midwest. And instead of redesigning for more resilient systems, we pretty much do the same thing. And it's a really unfortunate quality of human civilization is we don't think very long term. So another element of natural systems that are complex instead of complicated and supple is redundancy. In permaculture, we say stacked function redundancy. So every function serves many elements and every element serves many systems. So the tree not only is it acting as a buffer from the wind for the other organisms, it is reproducing itself, so making more. It is creating shade. Oftentimes, they also create food. They're also creating biomass from their leaves and branches that fall to the ground and build soil. They're also giving out pollen, which is food, but also medicine for many organisms. Like pine pollen is a precursor to an anabolic steroid, so it boosts vitality in organisms that eat leaves covered with pine pollen. The pollen also provides condensation nuclei because clouds don't just make rain, they need condensation nuclei, whether that's ash or dust or pollen, for the moisture in a cloud to cohere around. So I could keep going on a tree, but you get the idea of this redundancy. Everything serves many functions. So let's look at a human system, a car. We'll just take something like that. Very complicated. It pretty much serves the function of transportation. There's a much more limited amount of people that use them to live in. But beyond that, they don't really have many functions. They actually create a bunch of problems. So when the car dies, if it's not fixable, you could part it out and use those parts to fix other cars, but usually it just represents a recycling challenge. And many of the elements of them are toxic. So redundancy. So in a system that we design, let's say your home, here's another human system. It provides shelter, but it's also a place to store your things. It creates shade. It creates, an obstacle to traffic. So you create protected space behind a home, like your backyard, for instance. It's also a place to gather for humans. But what other ways can you stack functions and redundancy in your home? Having rain gutters. So all of a sudden your roof, that is the shelter part, can be gathering rain. And then you can store that rain for something else. So in our human systems, we want network solutions. We want all the elements of our human designed environments to be serving many functions. So your home also could have south facing or east or west facing windows that you could be growing plants in. And it could also be doing passive solar and warming your house. And this gets us into our human design systems, which are very fragile. And we see this whenever a natural disaster occurs, is it wreaks havoc because we have not designed resilient, regenerative, redundant systems for our human civilization. So what are the important constituents that make up a human settlement? I'm going to start with water first. Air is a bit of a given. We don't make air. We don't have to gather or store air, although we do in our human world have HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, and cooling. So we want the air to be of a certain temperature, but I'm going to leave air aside for a moment because the 3-3-3 rule. You can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. So those are going to be more paramount for us. And really, humans, we need food, clothing, and shelter. Those are a bit of the key elements of what it takes to survive. So with water, most humans in the industrialized nations rely on city water, which oftentimes goes through a water treatment plant, which requires electricity. And if there's a flood, that water treatment plant will be rendered, possibly obsolete or non-functional. And these systems are very expensive. Oftentimes they use a chemical means for the purification of water, most frequently chlorine, which is a poison. More modern ones are using ultraviolet light, which is not poisonous to human life, but it does kill microbes. On a smaller, slightly more resilient level, you might have a well, your own well or a neighborhood well. Pretty much all of these require electricity that is generated somewhere far from the point of use. So as soon as the power's out, you have no water. So that's the same for a well or city water. Some folks have gravity water from a spring. That's more common, a century ago when electricity wasn't as common, or if you're of a homestead mine. And the principle of gravity flow water is that you have a pipe that takes water from a water source, a spring or a stream or a river, that is, the intake is higher than the point of use. Here at my farm, we have a gravity flow water system and a well. So when the electricity goes out, I can just go close one valve, open another, and we still have water, which is pretty nice. If you're not in the scenario to have that, storing some rainwater is a good idea. And there's lots of tips and techniques and tools for how to do that safely and cleanly, because you might have all kind of debris landing on your roof that you maybe don't want going into water that you're going to be drinking. So you might have to purify that water or develop a system that is allowing the first rains of the season to wash the dust, ash, bird poop, pollen off the roof and discard that so that the subsequent rainwater is clean. And generally, rainwater is safe to drink. If you live in a more industrial area where there's output from, a factory or something like this, you may want to look into that, get your water tested. So after that is shelter. And, you know, in the event of a natural disaster, you can see all the people that become temporary migrants. And as evidenced by the recent flooding in Asheville, North Carolina, the federal agency FEMA is largely inept, despite spending billions of dollars, at actually helping people with shelter. Wildfires are another thing that challenge shelter. Most of our homes are built out of wood. So creating a more resilient housing shelter system might be looking at things like metal roofing that might be able to resist sparks and coals landing on them, burning leaves and burning your house down. Earthen construction, clay tiles, this type of thing. And when we look at old civilizations, they thought about these kind of things. Where I live in rural southwestern Oregon, all the original towns were all made out of wood with wood shingles. So whole towns would burn down with barely a trace of them because they were trying to build quickly. And usually the quick solution is not the most resilient solution. Doing things right oftentimes requires more time and more money and more design and careful thinking. One safety measure that we're doing in our community here with a community nonprofit that I'm on the board of directors of, we call A Greater Applegate, that looks out for the residents and human and otherwise for our river valley that has about 20,000 people living in it, but really far spaced out, is working with identifying centers that could be a community resilience hub in the event of a disaster. So we've identified 2 locations where, working with the Red Cross, we can procure funds for drinking water, food, shelter, and cots for sleeping, and some basic medical supplies, but also because we're in a rural community space where people can bring livestock trailers to protect large animals in the event of a wildfire or a hurricane or something like that. So food is something that I think everyone should, on the more individual level, strive to have some level of resilience. And most people just have a few days' supply of food in their home. You might want to strive for having a week or 2 or longer, because I know here we've had some big snowstorms that have knocked out power, but also compromised our roads. And some people were not able to get out for 2 weeks. So, they might have to snowshoe out or something to get just basic supplies. So things like non-perishable goods, canned foods, dried foods in rodent and insect-proof storage is a good idea, and rotating that stock. A buddy of mine has done some deeper dives into this and suggests getting the things that you eat. Those of you that were around during the Y2K scare in late 1999 know that many people bought buckets of lentils and rice and things that aren't things they really eat. And then after that passed and we realized the coast was clear, a lot of people had a lot of food that they didn't eat. But things like cans of tuna or canned beans, these can store for a long time. And they're things a lot of us eat: pasta sauce, noodles in good storage, this type of thing. There's lots of resources out there. I'll drop a few in the show notes if you want to look into that. But obviously, growing some of your own food, having a freezer, because things will stay frozen for a long time as long as you're not opening and closing the freezer, especially if you have backup power. of some sort, whether that's solar and batteries, hydro, or a generator. Meat, so in the event of a disaster, you want to eat your frozen things first, because if there's no guarantee the power's coming back on, you want to think that through. Another really amazing way to store food is, it's called meat on the hoof, so live animals. So we have about 25 sheep, and they don't require refrigeration until you kill them. So uh, having animals that you could, whether it's domesticated ones that you can slaughter, or if you know how to hunt or fish. So we have a few ponds that are stocked with fish. And in my mind, those are a bit of an emergency backup system, and that we could resort to fishing in the event of a significant natural disaster or a destabilizing event societally, which do occur and have occurred many times for every civilization that's ever been. Hurricane Katrina would be one if you wanted to brush up on your recent history. So another thing that's really important, you don't notice you don't have it until they're down, is your communications, whether that's your telephone or the internet. These are very fragile. They're very brittle. Perhaps landlines less so. The old school phones didn't require electricity. So that would be something in your area to look into, is to have an old corded phone and see if that still works, just as a backup, because that would be really helpful, especially because so many of us are used to 24/7 access to communication through our cellular phones. Another backup, and I just visited some friends in the Nevada City, California area, which is in the foothills of the Sierras, and we had a community meeting about how to develop resilient, regenerative community solutions. And one of their local internet providers was there, and they have a satellite-based internet with a tower with backup generators and sufficient fuel to make it at least a week. So not only do people have, if their cell phones work, if they're able to charge the battery, they got the appropriate satellite phones, like walkie-talkies, that will work like that and have people in a communication grid that can be a node for their neighborhood. So thinking of your communications, ham radio is another one if you have the electricity to power it. I have a few hand crank solar power with a battery, simple shortwave radios, so you can log into your local weather station or emergency service broadcast. So again, redundancy. You want redundancy in communications, because if you're shut out, that's going to be really hard for you. And then you want to test these things periodically. So put it on your calendar. Check the batteries, check these kind of things. That goes too for things like flashlights, candles, your food storage. I have a little clipboard telling me in my food storage when I put it there, so I can know how good are they, because canned foods last a long time, but if you go through a period where perhaps you lose your HVAC or your heating source, and possibly you're building up humidity, hopefully you're building up humility too, because that's always good to have. A little hard to store on a shelf. But canned goods can rust, and I've seen it happen. Same with the metal lids on jars of things like salsa or pasta sauce in long-term storage. They don't last forever. Another thing that you want to have in redundancy is transport. So we all rely on our cars and trucks, but as soon as you run out of gas, that isn't useful. So, here on our farm, because it's a farm, we've got a few hundred gallons of diesel and hundreds of gallons of gasoline, which is not only helpful for your transportation, but also running chainsaws, weed whackers, generators, that kind of thing. But even having a motorbike, living rurally, I've been thinking about getting a dual sport motorbike in case trees are down on the roads, and to be able to get and check on neighbors, or go get some supplies if roads are down or compromised. I watched a film that had some good points but got many things wrong, called Homestead, that came out this winter. And one note I picked up from that I thought was brilliant was durable electric mountain bikes, because they're silent. So if you're in a situation where perhaps there's societal destabilization, maybe you don't want a super loud dual sport motorcycle announcing your presence. But those electric mountain bikes are silent, and conserve human energy, calories, compared to having the next thing I want to talk about, just bicycles, mountain bikes. They can get you there, or even a scooter or something, depending on if it's downhill or uphill. But again, you got to keep all this stuff in good working order. And then the next category that you want to have your own medical supplies, simple things. To whatever they pretty much need to match your ability to use them. If you don't know how to do sutures, having that kind of equipment, you don't want to have to be learning how to do this in an emergency situation for the first time. And a buddy of mine who served in the armed forces had a great saying, is that we do not rise to the occasion in stressful scenarios. We fall back to our level of training. So, here having a farm, we have to do basic maintenance on a lot of our equipment. So when things break, we usually have spare parts or a shop and the various tools to do some repairs. But you want to practice these kind of things. And more I've been thinking about this as I watch the ineptitude and which is truly scathing of our state and federal agencies to respond to natural disasters, and county for that purpose, is doing fire drills or some kind of emergency preparedness drills periodically. And I'm hoping to initiate that in our neighborhood more regularly, that we have times, an example would be, let's pretend next week on this day that there's no power for, start with something simple, 4 hours. How do you do? How do you do when there's no water that comes out of your tap? And then take it to 8 hours. It's much easier to do that when you're like, well, you know what, I really want to take a shower and I could just flip the switch and have hot water, than during a natural disaster where you're like, dang, I should have filled up extra propane tanks for my propane hot water, or whatever it is. Have a few gallons of drinking water stored in a garage. These are simple things to do, and in permaculture, we have a saying: make hay when the sun's shining. So do these things when it's easy. If you're making hay in the rain, it's going to rot and spoil, and it doesn't work. So I could keep going down this list of granular points to consider, but for each of us, we're going to map this differently. And I'll use the example of, I have a friend who's a diabetic, and she splits her time between the United States and Australia because she's from there. She keeps a supply of insulin in my fridge. So if she were here and couldn't get it, something that she literally would die if she didn't have, she has. So for some of those things for yourself, stock up on medications or these kind of things. Each of us is going to have a different thing. A musician, guitar strings might be really high on their list of something to have extra, because all of this stuff is not a matter of if, it's when. And if we go back to the time of the Great Depression, and I'll close with this as just a thought experiment, because for many of us, that you don't have to go back very far. I had two grandparents who were born in the year 1920, so they were 10, 13 going through the Great Depression. But back then, 70% of Americans either lived or grew up on a farm. So even if you lived in the city, chances are that you are just one generation away from relatives in the country that you could go to a farm. And if I had $1 for every person that told me that when the shit hits the fan, they're coming to my farm, I'd be a rich man. But the sad thing is, none of these people have ever invested in me developing one of the more resilient systems in our region. And maybe we want to think about doing that. And I know certain people that go in on buying a rural piece of land, an eco-village, something like this, or invest in a community farm, or even just start simple, invest in a community-supported agriculture system. Know your farmers, know your woodsmen, if you eat with wood, know your local mechanics. And lastly, I want to just talk about that idea of local, because during that time of the Great Depression, people relied on their local community, their local village, and many of that was happening through the church. And I see now in our modern society, our welfare state, where a huge amount of people are receiving some kind of federal assistance for either their food or their housing or their health care, rather than how I grew up. Even I was born in 1972, many people relied on the church. And I'm sure it was that way much before, or your synagogue or other place of worship, because these are people that you have shared spiritual values, shared morality, and you care about them. and they care about you and your family. And how do we build these systems during peacetime, during a time where there aren't stresses, so that when we need to call upon them, we can? It's sort of like investing in in your bank account, so you have something to draw upon. So invest in your social capital, so that you and get used to doing some civic activity, volunteering, donating, so that we build that supple system that isn't brittle. And yeah, I just want to encourage people to think like that, so that you are an asset during a time of challenge rather than a burden. And I'll leave it on that note, because I think at this point, I would say the vast majority of Americans will be a burden upon their neighbors, their community, and the state, federal, and local agencies during a time of challenge. Rather than being able to show up with, here in the country, I just say show up with a truck and a chainsaw and tools, and you're helpful, and a strong body. So keep your body strong and keep your mind strong. And all of this activity, I think, thinking this way and being ready will enable your mind to be strong and maybe even help out your mental health as well. So hopefully you got something there. I'll have a follow-up of this with possibly an interview with some friends who are able to bring their own wisdom and experience from their own lived experience about why some of these things are important. But this, I just wanted to kind of create a lay of the land as I see it. So thanks so much. Check out our other episodes, and feel free to share this with your friends in your community, um, and, and and get the word out there, because it'll help all of us if we are a more supple civilization. So thank you.